Hello and welcome to lesson 2 of week 11. In this lesson, we are going to look at the grid layout model. My name is Mildred. In the last lesson, we looked at the flex layout, and the grid layout is similar to the flex layout. I have the page and without any layout. So I'm going to try to demonstrate how to use the grid layout. We are not going to go into details of this because we are not going to use it, but I'm going to mention the properties and their values, and then I want you to play around with it and try it out in case if it is something of interest to you. Now, for the grid layout, just like the flex layout, we have to first of all define a grid container. So I'm going to do that here. So I'm going to say .grid container. And here we have to specify the display, and the display has to be either grid if you want it block level or inline grid like this. So we want all the direct children of the grid container to have a margin, let's say of 10 pixels. We want them to have a padding of 5 pixels. And then we'll go to the HTML page, and then we try to put the class attribute with the value of grid container. I will save this and I will refresh for you to see that there will be no difference on the page as yet. For us to begin to position these three elements, so we talk about the nav, the article, and the section. We have three columns. We have a property for us to add at the grid container that gives us the number of columns we want and what the size of each column should be, and the number of rows we want and what the size of each row should be. Now we need only columns for this structure, and so we are going to use a property called the grid template columns, written like this, and we want it to automatically size them, and we're going to put 3 autos, which means put 3 columns and make sure that their size are automatically sized. When I save this and refresh, we are going to have this position in columns. In the event that we have rows, let's say we have 2 columns and we want them to be displayed over 2 rows. So the first and the second will be in the first row and the third will be in the second row. At this time, we'll specify the grid template rows and we'll put a value of auto here, since we want it to have 2 rows and we want each row to have the automatically sized values of auto. So when I save this and I refresh, we'll have this in 2 rows, first and second, and the third here. But this is not what we want, so we won't use the grid template rows. We have another property called the gap property that we can use. So if we put the gap here, either we specify a column gap and put how much space we want between the columns, let's say 20 pixels, and we specify a row gap in the case where we have more than 1 row, or we use a gap property as a shorthand for column and row and specify the row gap and the column gap as we want them to be. So I can use the gap and say I want the row gap to be 50 pixels when I have more than 1 row, and the column gap to be 50 pixels when I have, but now I have just columns, and so I'll use column gap to be, let's say, 20 pixels. Save this, refresh my page, and I have this. I have not put the third column here, so I still have them in 2 rows. So I have it this way. So this is how we use the grid layout to specify the position of the different grid items on the page. So we have properties like the justify content property to specify the horizontal alignment. We have things like the align content property to specify the vertical alignment of the grid items. We also have properties that we specify on the grid items, that's the items within the container, to put where things like the row span and col span, but this time they are named grid column start, grid column end, grid row start, grid row end, and then we have grid area properties. So you read about these properties and see where they apply and how they apply. But this is as far as we will go with the grid layout. It's not going to be a layout we are going to use. I'll be using more of the grid view layout where we divide the page into 12 columns. Thank you and see you in the next lesson.